All right, so we're about to begin our second session, and I am very pleased to introduce, there she is, my friend Shari Huhndorf. Shari received her PhD in comparative literature from NYU. She's currently professor of Native American Studies and Comparative Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley, where she teaches literary and visual culture, cultural studies, and gender studies. Shari is the author of 2 books, Going Native, Indians in the American Imagination, and Mapping the Americas, the Transnational Politics of Contemporary Native Culture. She is also the co-editor of Indigenous Women and Feminism, Politics, Activism, Culture, and another book, Sovereignty, Indigeneity, and the Law, both of which won notable awards, are credited to her and co-editors. Last year, 2013, she received 2 awards that are worth mentioning, a Distinguished Teaching Award from the Division of Social Science at UC Berkeley, and the prestigious President's Award from the Alaska Federation of Natives for her contributions to Native education. Her talk today is entitled Culture and the Politics of Indigenous Transnationalism. Afterwards, responses will be given by David Porter, a professor of English and Comparative Literature here at UM, and myself. So please welcome Shari Huhndorf.
So first I want to say thank you to Professor Lyons, Askew, and Luong for the invitation. So this is an event to which I would have traveled from across the country to hear the other panelists. So it's a real honor to be invited and to be asked to speak. And I also want to thank Pat Lord for her absolutely masterful organizing and for making everything so easy. So I was born and raised in Alaska. I still consider that home. I go home with my children as often as I can. But now I live in a place of endless summer, which is really hard to complain about. But I have to say it's really nice to be in a place where winter is in the air, at least, not real winter yet, but it makes me feel like home. So thank you for that too. I am actually not going to be talking about the global indigenous peoples movement. As you might have been able to tell from Scott's introduction, I work more on cultural studies issues. I think particularly about the connections between culture and politics, and those are the connections I'm going to be drawing today in my talk. So there is a very significant body of scholarship that talks about the ways in which culture has been absolutely essential to the process of colonialism. And by colonialism, I mean in this case the dispossession and political domination of indigenous peoples. That's true in part because culture is a very powerful tool for shaping worldviews, and there are very material political effects that emerge from that. There's also, by now, a significant body of work that thinks about the ways in which Native resistance, in which culture plays an integral role in Native resistance. And that's true in a number of ways for a number of reasons. And there are other people in this room whose work relates to that topic, so perhaps we can discuss that in more detail later. In this paper, I'm going to be focusing on the connections between culture and land claims issues in particular, and arguing that culture plays an integral role in indigenous peoples' efforts to regain territory. And in focusing on that issue, I'm asking in particular 3 questions. What can culture contribute to our understanding of land that other political processes, such as activism, perhaps cannot? How does culture conceive of a land claims project across the boundaries of tribes and communities? And of course, that is a distinct challenge of the indigenous peoples movement to find commonalities across bounds of culture and tribe, because indigenous endeavors are very much grounded in local political concerns. And the final question is, how does culture connect land claims to other political issues that have increasingly come to the fore in the indigenous peoples movement? And those include questions of gender and environmental destruction. So I'm going to be looking in particular at 3 cultural texts, an art installation, a map, and a novel, to think about how those 3 texts engage major land claims issues in the United States and Canada since the 1970s. In the post-World War II era, the cross-currents and affiliations that draw indigenous peoples together across boundaries of language, culture, and nation have given rise to shared social identities and political purposes. The transnational indigenous peoples movement emerges from global political and economic shifts that render it ever more difficult to understand indigenous communities as isolated or autonomous entities, as well as from changes in the international political arena, such as decolonization and the fight against fascism. Shared relationships to land that predate the arrival of settlers, histories of colonization, and struggles for political autonomy provide a foundation for global political alliances. While the transnational indigenous peoples movement is thus largely bound to local concerns, it has also brought to the fore issues that extend beyond the tribal. Women's organizing, for example, has gained significant momentum in this new constellation of relationships, suggesting the possibilities it holds for indigenous feminisms. By operating in the international arena and bringing to light shared histories that reveal the origins of nation-states in conquest and dispossession, such political formations level crucial challenges to the power and authority of these nation-states as they open new paths for regaining land and autonomy. As global political and economic shifts have transformed indigenous organizing, so too have they reshaped native cultural production. Since the 1980s, as I have argued elsewhere, indigenous culture has increasingly emphasized issues that emerge from global movements of capital and empire. These include the imposition of patriarchy, environmental exploitation, and capitalist labor formations, along with long-standing preoccupations with land and sovereignty. In this paper, I analyze connections between culture and transnational indigenous politics, focusing in particular on how contemporary artists and writers engage land conflicts and bring to light their connections to more recent political concerns. But why does culture matter in indigenous politics? More specifically, what can it contribute to our understanding of colonial dispossession and ongoing land conflicts? Can it support indigenous claims to land, and if so, how? Finally, what light can it shed on the possibilities of transnational indigenous organizing? Historically, the dispossession of indigenous peoples has hinged not only on material force, on the ability of colonizing nations to remove natives and to seize their territories, but also on colonial discourses about land and its original inhabitants. In particular, European appropriations of territory depend on conceptions of land that render it as abstract geometrical space, devoid of history and reduced to exchange value. This is what Henri Lefebvre describes as the homogeneous space of capital, the subordination of land to the unifying but abstract principle of property, antithetical to the sacred and to lived experience. That was in part a quote. Not incidentally, this notion of space emerged with the so-called Age of Discovery, when Europe staked its first imperial claims across the globe, and it coincided with the earliest commercial uses of land as property. At the same time, colonial discourse has erased indigenous peoples to represent land as wilderness, as empty space free for the taking, as it has also represented natives as savages who were unfit to hold land title. The moral justification for dispossession, writes geographer Cole Harris, this is a quote, lay in a cultural discourse that located civilization and savagery and identified the land uses associated with each, end quote. This racial logic in turn forecasts the inevitable demise of indigenous peoples in the wake of modernity. If Native people did not become civilized, continues Harris, and if in a changing world it was no longer possible for them to be savage, then they would die out. That was a quote. Such notions have been disseminated in part through visual and narrative practices that take land as their subject. While landscape imagery, as we shall see, has defined land as an object to be claimed and exploited, European maps have constituted what geographer J. Brian Harley labels statements of territorial appropriation in colonial contexts. Narrative practices, too, have played a key role in dispossession. Not only are meanings of place, as cultural geographers explain, constituted via language, but also conflicts surrounding the ownership and occupation of land, contends Edward Said, have been reflected, contested, and even decided in narrative. That was another quote. Contemporary Native visual and literary culture, in my reading, contests representations of space and Indigenous peoples that underlie colonial dispossession, as it depicts community histories on the land that support Native claims. Throughout the colonized world, Indigenous land claims have hinged not only on legal agreements, such as treaties, but also on histories of long-term occupation, the basis of the common law doctrine of Aboriginal title. Traditional Indigenous cultural expressions established community histories on the land and served as legal documents in territorial disputes. Contemporary cultural texts similarly provide counter-histories to dominant narratives that erase Native people as they lend moral weight to Native claims by depicting the obscured violence of colonization. Moreover, these texts depart from those of earlier periods by representing struggles for land as transnational endeavors that cut across tribal boundaries and take place through intertribal alliances. To make these arguments, I analyzed three cultural texts that engage contemporary land conflicts. Erica Lord's multimedia installation, Native American Land Reclamation Project, which was created in 2000. An online map created in conjunction with the Inuit film Atinarjuat. As many of you may remember, Atinarjuat was a sort of major international phenomenon in 2001. There was a website associated with the film that interestingly includes a map that maps the story onto the place of Nunavut. And Linda Hogan's novel Solar Storms, which was published in 1997. In analyzing these works, I attend not only to their subjects, but also to their modes of representation, in particular to the possibilities that various visual and narrative practices offer for reinscribing spaces, and in so doing, supporting Indigenous claims to territory. So I'm, as you're going to quickly see, technologically challenged, and I lose a lot of credibility in classes because of this, but I'm going to do my best with these images. This is an image of, of Erica Lord's Native American Land Reclamation Project. Okay, why can't I get it to, there we go. Erica Lord is an Athabascan artist from Alaska, and it's actually difficult to get a good sense of this installation from the image. But here's what it's like. I saw it a number of years ago at the Institute for American Indian Arts at Santa Fe. And the installation is an enclosed space, and it's an enclosed room. And you enter through these curtains, and you find yourself in the room surrounded by mirrors. Now, if you look closely, and it's actually maybe a bit too dark for you to see this, but up here in the corner, you can actually see the photographer taking a picture of the installation. And one of the important parts of the installation is that it's impossible to be invisible within it. And I'm going to talk about why that's significant. But anyway, it's an enclosed room. There are mirrors on all sides, and from the ceiling are hanging prayer bundles. And I'm going to talk a little bit about their significance. Erica Lord's multimedia installation, Native American Land Reclamation Project, takes as its subject the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, or ANCSA, the largest Indigenous land claim settlement in U.S. history. In 1971, the settlement extinguished Aboriginal title in Alaska in exchange for $962.5 million and 44 million acres, about 1/9 of the state and nearly as much land as all Indian reservations in the United States combined. ANCSA marks a significant departure from previous land claims, not only because of its size, but also because it was the first to use corporations to administer resources. And there's a lot to be said about the implications of that. And Jen Stahl has worked on this. I won't say much about that now, but there are these sort of strange things that result. So those of us who belong to ANCSA corporations don't have tribal enrollment cards, we have shareholder cards. So it's a sort of very strange form of community membership. Rather than creating reservations, it transferred fee-simple land title to settlement lands to for-profit corporations owned by Alaska Natives. Prompted by the discovery of oil on Alaska's North Slope, ANCSA aimed to transform land into a resource for economic exploitation. More than 4 decades later, the effects of the settlement on Alaska Native communities remain complex and contradictory, a subject that extends beyond the scope of this paper. What remains clear, though, is that ANCSA, like all Indigenous land claim settlements, is fundamentally an act of colonial dispossession, a means by which the state claimed legal title, in this case, to 8/9 of traditional Indigenous territories in Alaska. It did so in part by redefining land as property, as Lefebvre's homogeneous space of capital, thus negating traditional Native meanings, histories, and uses of land. Native American Land Reclamation Project contests this appropriation of territory by reiterating Native senses of space and bringing to light the violence at the heart of dispossession. Walking into the installation, spectators find themselves in an enclosed room with mirrored walls. From its ceiling hang prayer bundles, 371 in all, one for each treaty the United States ratified with indigenous nations, all subsequently broken. And I want to underscore the significance of that. So this is an installation that thematizes in particular land claim settlement in Alaska, but also puts that in relation to land claims issues throughout the United States. And here's the sort of intertribal dimension. Well, there are multiple intertribal dimensions. Here's one. Each bundle contains earth from Alaska Native villages, Indian reservations, and other tribal lands from across the continent. The prayer bundles insist on the sacred meanings of these lands, meanings that counter their capitalist renderings as resources for economic exploitation. Because the bundles hold earth from places across Native America, the installation situates Alaska in a longer history of dispossession as the foundation, shared by indigenous people throughout the U.S., showing Native dispossession as the foundation of U.S. history. The bundles are tied with cloth taken from the red stripes of the U.S. flag. Here, red signifies not only the sacredness of land, but also, because the strips are taken from the flag and because red is the color of blood, the violence of dispossession. This invocation of theft and violence undercuts the legal and moral claims of the U.S. to stolen land, a challenge signified by the destruction of the national flag. As the installation thus underscores the histories and meanings of land that support indigenous claims, it reworks practices of spectatorship that have historically been bound up with colonial power. And this is the significance of there's no place to be invisible in the installation. By taking land as the subject of a museum display, Native American Land Reclamation Project calls up a history of landscape representation that is implicated in dispossession. In early modern Europe, during the advent of colonialism, landscape emerged as a genre from shifts in conceptions and representations of space, including the development of perspective in painting. Landscape facilitated these changing meanings and uses of space through its visual effects. Perspective created a sense of depth, and thus the illusion of realism. In other words, the fantasy of gazing at the land itself rather than at its aesthetic rendering. It placed the spectator at the center of a field of vision, enabling a sense of mastery that Denise Cosgrove labels the visual appropriation of space. And here's a quote from Cosgrove. Realist representation through linear perspective directs the external world toward the individual located outside that space. It gives the eye absolute mastery over space. Visually, space is rendered the property of the individual detached observer, from whose divine location it is a dependent appropriated object. That's the end of the quote. This positioning of the spectator, in turn, obscures colonial violence, a strategy that Mary Louise Pratt labels anti-conquest. In this process, she explains, this is another quote, European bourgeois subjects seek to secure their innocence in the same moment as they assert European hegemony, end quote. The seeing man, as the white male subject of European landscape discourse, those are Pratt's terms, exemplifies this subject position because it is he whose imperial eyes passively look at and possess. That's another quote. Native American Land Reclamation Project, by contrast, disallows a detached spectatorial position that enables a sense of mastery over land. Instead, the mirrors place spectators within the field of vision, where they see themselves surrounded by the prayer bundles. In this way, the installation transforms the exhibition space from one of spectacle to one of encounter, in which viewers must confront their own relationship to indigenous territory. This invokes a native conception of space premised on relationality that counters colonial mastery. It also compels spectators to locate themselves in relation to the process of dispossession and reclamation thematized by the installation. And of course, that's going to vary according to who the spectator is. By bringing to bear the histories and understandings of space that support Indigenous claims, Native American Land Reclamation Project engages in an act of territorial reclamation against the interests of capital and the state. The installation supports Native claims in yet another way. When the spectator is Native, it renders visible a contemporary Native presence on the land that carries legal implications. It is this enduring presence of Native peoples and the implications of this history for land conflicts that are at the center of the map from the Inuit film Ahtnarjuat. So I will try to pull that up next. Okay, so this is the best I could do because there, if you go to the website for Ahtnarjuat, you can pull this up in its full size, and this is actually what is it called when you interact with the map? There's a term for that. I can't think of what it is right now. But you can sort of click on these different spaces on the map, and the story that is Ahtnarjuat sort of manifests in these different spaces. And that's politically significant for reasons I'll describe. There's one thing in this section, as I was rereading the paper, this section of my analysis that isn't quite clear, that's crucially important. And that is to the extent to which Inuit land claims, actually throughout the Arctic, is inherently a transnational process. So one of the things that happened in the Arctic in the mid-20th century that was part of colonialism was creating an entity of Inuitness, or Eskimo-ness, whichever term you prefer, among communities that saw themselves as being historically, culturally, in many cases linguistically distinct, and communities that were geographically dispersed. And that means something really particular in the Arctic. It doesn't just mean distance, it means impassable distance. So there are no roads. You can't drive from place to place. This sense of a common Inuit identity has also been integral to land claims. And there have been other scholars who've argued in particular about the ways in which media has played a crucial role in creating the sense of Inuit identity that was instrumental in Inuit claims to land. Okay, so the map. Like Lord's installation, the film Ahtnarjuat, the Fast Runner, emerged out of a major land claim settlement in the Arctic. The Nunavut Land Claims Agreement, the largest Indigenous settlement in Canadian history, transformed 350,000 square kilometers of the eastern and central Arctic into a new territory controlled by Inuit, who comprise about 85% of its population. Ahtnarjuat was released in 2001, only 2 years after the 1999 implementation of the Nunavut Agreement. And the film, I have argued elsewhere, reiterated the cultural and legal premises for Inuit territorial claims. The first Inuit-produced feature and wide-release film in an Indigenous language, and that was Inuktitut. And Ahtnarjuat told a story based on a traditional legend, and it featured beliefs such as shamanism and practices, community rituals, throat singing, and other things that have long been central to traditional Inuit life. Throughout Native America, cultural distinctiveness provides a crucial rationale for political autonomy, and the film calls attention to Inuit difference and its deep historical roots. Additionally, the act of self-representation, as Stephen Lutholt argues, entails a shift in authority that positions Inuit people as active political agents, that was his term, a process that Faye Ginsburg labels a rhetoric of self-determination that accords with political sovereignty. As Ahtnarjuat drew widespread international acclaim, it thus brought global visibility to Inuit claims to land and political control in the Arctic. The film calls up the basis for Inuit territorial claims in yet another way. Through both story and image, Ahtnarjuat focuses heavily on land and its traditional uses. In 1973, the Calder Supreme Court decision in Canada set the stage for contemporary Aboriginal campaigns for land and political sovereignty by establishing the legal basis for Aboriginal title as, quote, long-term occupation, possession, and use. That's a term from the decision of territories. As a dramatization of a traditional legend, the story of Ahtnarjuat transpires before colonial transformations of Inuit life. Critics have often remarked upon the story's timelessness, a characterization that disengages it from history and politics. Instead, I would argue, the story unfolds in a realm that is enduring rather than atemporal, depicting ways of life that have endured for centuries and thus cannot be tied to a particular historical moment preceding colonization. The story takes shape around seasonal patterns of subsistence, fishing, caribou hunting, gathering berries, that have defined traditional Inuit life since time immemorial, while the camera often lingers on the geographies where such activities take place. In these ways, the film visually depicts the histories and practices that constitute, to invoke that legal term again, long-term occupation, possession, and use of traditional lands on which Aboriginal title hinges. There's much to be said about the use of media to accomplish these goals, but here I'm concerned in particular with the film's use of cartography. The film Atinarjuat, it could be argued, itself constitutes a kind of map. Ranging widely across Inuit territory, it visually depicts the disparate places that now constitute Nunavut and draws them together into a single story. But significantly, the website that accompanies the film includes a conventional Western map titled The Legend on the Land. Here, the filmmakers strategically deploy and rework a visual technology that has long been implicated in colonial appropriations of territory. European maps of the colonial period, explains geographer J. Brian Harley, constituted statements of territorial appropriation that helped to invent America in the European consciousness, as well as devices by which a Native American presence could be silent. Those are his terms. As such, maps thus constituted material instruments of dispossession, and they also served to consolidate political authority. Benedict Anderson has described the ways in which maps serve to delineate political boundaries, to anticipate spatial reality in a way that was necessary for the new administrative mechanisms to back up their claims. That was a quote. But such European maps, Harley reminds us, always had Indigenous counterparts. Indigenous alternative cartographies of the colonial period constituted a conscious strategy of resistance to European territorial control by providing a record of past ownership and a challenge to appropriation by the colonists. These spatial histories, as Harley labels them, are generically ambiguous, drawing together visual and narrative elements to assert Indigenous histories on the land that contradict myths of empty space and virgin land that legitimate European occupation. Like the alternative cartographies that Harley describes, the map of Atinarjuat uses cartography as an instrument of possession by narrating suppressed histories of Native occupation that lend weight to Indigenous claims. The map situates the legend of Atinarjuat in time at the dawn of the first millennium, that's from the map, as well as in place, locating the story's events on a map anachronistically but strategically named Nunavut. Nunavut, of course, is a term that emerges the land claim settlement. While the ethnographic convention of timelessness transforms Indigenous people, in Eric Wolf's terms, into people without history and thus without a future, Isuma's framing of Atinarjuat instead conveys that Inuit have occupied the land for millennia, a long history that sets a precedent for continued control. The map depicts the film's characters ranging widely in seasonal migrations, histories and practices that render the land meaningful on Indigenous terms, and further support contemporary Indigenous possession. By making the Indigenous presence visible, and here's one of the reasons why media is important, the map counters colonial erasures of Indigenous peoples from the land that support European ownership. At the same time, the legend on the land creates a sense of collective identity among geographically dispersed communities by depicting Nunavut as a coherent, bounded entity and giving the imagined community a long and distinctive history. It is not just the visual dimensions of the map that are important to these political endeavors. Because of the entwined cultural, historical, and social meanings of land in Indigenous contexts, Native maps have taken narrative as well as visual forms in a process that Indigenous geographer Margaret Wickens Pierce labels mapping by words, and this is a quote from Pierce. We have historically constructed an absence of Native mapping by entwining the artifacts which, by definition, were designed to erase Native landscapes and render Indians invisible. To locate native mapping, then, we must look beyond the printed maps of colonial narratives and into the realm of daily mapping activities. Maps are representations that facilitate a spatial understanding, and mapping is the process of creating and interpreting these representations, end quote. Indeed, because indigenous spatialities have defined land in terms of its sacred and social dimensions, narrative has arguably been even more crucial than visuality in conveying native senses of space. Linda Hogan's novel, Solar Storms, the subject of the final section of this paper, scrutinizes European cartography. Maps are recurring figures in the book, as it engages in a project of mapping by words to convey the sacred and social dimensions of space. At the same time, it underscores connections among dispossession, gendered violence, and environmental exploitation to redefine the politics of native resistance. And I turn now to Solar Storms. Solar Storms tells a story about contemporary land conflicts that centers on the building of a dam. At the novel's beginning, the teenaged character Angel Wing returns to her child home in Adam's Rib. It's hard not to comment on the biblical implications, but I'm setting that aside for now. After traumatic years spent in foster homes, tumultuous events begin to unfold shortly after she arrives. The ancient Dora Rouge, Angel's great-great-grandmother, announces her wish to return to her home community in the north, Inuit territory, to die. And messengers from that area arrive to warn that flooding from newly constructed dams will soon devastate the land. The story is a fictional rewriting of the catastrophe that ensued when, in the early 1970s, the Quebec government diverted rivers flowing into James Bay to construct a hydroelectric plant. The dams flooded traditional territories of Cree and Inuit communities, igniting a struggle between Indigenous groups and the Canadian government that raged for decades and ultimately culminated in a land claim settlement. The novel situates this conflict in a history of dispossession that commenced with the arrival of European explorers, and its anti-colonial critique extends to gender, exposing environmental devastation and sexual violence as twin forms of colonial destruction. Shortly after Angel's arrival, she joins Agnes, Dora Rouge's daughter, and Bush, Angel's adoptive grandmother, to bring Dora Rouge back to her birthplace. Their journey north becomes, in one sense, a journey back in time that retraces European explorers' routes and exposes the devastation that ensued from them, the place of the dam in this history, and the colonial spatiality that underlies these endeavors. At the same time, the novel discloses an indigenous spatiality expressed through traditional knowledge that counters colonial discourses that subordinate indigenous women and land. By unraveling narratives that cast conquest as progress and redemption, and by relating suppressed histories, native spatialities, and histories, Solar Storm supports Indigenous claims to land in the story and the James Bay conflict that inspired it. Solar Storms accomplishes this political work in part through figures of maps. In Solar Storms, when Angel, Dora Rouge, Agnes, and Bush commence their journey north, they follow ancient maps created by European explorers that clarify these connections between cartography and conquest. One bears an image of a sinking boat, its Indian passengers chained together as slaves bound for Europe. These are, in the words of the novel, incredible topographies, the territories and tricks and lies of history created by men possessed with the spoils of this land, whose legacy was the removal of the spirit from everything. As such, these maps overlook people and animal lives as well as the carnage brought about by European settlement and the establishment of the fur trade. 300 years later, the hydroelectric project similarly represents land through their figures, their measurements, and ledgers as a flat, two-dimensional world, and those are terms from the novel. These correspondences between historical and contemporary cartographic renderings of space and the resulting exploitation define the hydroelectric project as the latest episode of a conquest that commenced with European exploration. As the women follow the ancient routes and maps of travelers, their story unravels the myths and spatialities that rationalize European claims to territory. We were undoing the routes of explorers, ruminates Angel, taking apart the advance of commerce, narrowing down and distilling the truth out of history. That was a quote from the novel. While European maps suppress history to depict land as available for appropriation, the waterways, in the novel's words, had a history. Often carried in oral narratives rather than official documents, this history testifies to an ongoing Indigenous presence, as well as to the material enactments of power on Indigenous land and bodies that fall outside of colonial discourses. Angel recalls, for instance, the story of the Indigenous woman who first encountered white men in the territory and saw, quote, the windfield sails of their graceful boat of death, a tormented world, its true cargo, end quote. Little did she know then that because of their arrival, another quote, beloved children would be mutilated, women cut open and torn, that strong, brave men would die, and that even their gods would be massacred, end quote. This story inverts the conventional encounter narrative, while Indigenous place names render conquest legible from an Indigenous perspective. Poison Road, the main street in Angel's hometown, recalls the slaughter of wild animals to make room for European settlers, while Bone Island holds the remains of victims of epidemics that annihilated entire tribes. By exposing these histories, the journey contests colonial narratives that erase Indigenous peoples and cast colonization as progress. In Solar Storms, land and women's bodies are intersecting sites of colonization, a conjunction that signals integral connections among patriarchy, dispossession, and conquest. Like the landscape, women's bodies are physically marked by violence. Agnes tells Angel about meeting the young Loretta, who would become Angel's grandmother, and Angel's mother, actually, and whose body, like the land, was scarred and poisoned. And this is a quote. Loretta smelled of something sweet, an almond odor that I couldn't place until years later. When I finally placed the odor, when I knew it was cyanide, I knew who she was, what people she came from. She came from the Elk Islanders, the people who became so hungry they ate the poisoned carcasses of deer that the settlers left out for the wolves. The curse on that poor girl's life came from watching the desperate people of her tribe die. After that, when she was still a girl, she'd been taken and used by men who fed her and beat her and forced her, end quote. Because of this torture, Loretta becomes the one who hurt others, and the story of her daughter Hannah repeats that of her mother. When Hannah appears as a young child at Adam's rib, she too exudes the smell of cyanide, a smell deeper than skin, blood deep, history deep, and her skin was a garment of scars, of burns and incisions, the signatures of torturers. Her body, in Bush's words, is a battleground, a place where time and history and genocide meet, a description that resonates with the disputed territory in the story. Angel's body, too, is marked and scarred, some of the wounds inflicted by Hannah. By condemning these entangled forms of colonial violence, Solar Storms disputes colonial narratives that use gender to justify dispossession, that's another story, and conversely use dispossession to subordinate Indigenous women. As the journey unfolds, the novel engages in twin projects of remapping the land and redefining the place of Indigenous women in territorial conflicts. The explorer's map significantly crumbles in Bush's hands, and the women uncover a deeper map, the map inside ourselves, drawn from the old ways, the ways we used to live. Their journey repeats and undoes European journeys of exploration by returning to the old ways remembered by Dora Rouge. This alternative spatiality revives the ancient pact humans had once made with animals and recognizes land as alive, changing, and multidimensional, refusing to be shaped by the makers of maps. Those are terms from the novel. Such understandings and the long histories of occupation they reflect carry political implications for the territorial disputes in the novel. Defiant land, and again, this is a quote, defiant land with its own will made it difficult for Europeans to claim title. While the histories recounted by the novel contest the claims of government agents who, quote, insisted the people had no legal rights to the land, end quote, by establishing that Angel's own people had lived there forever, this is another quote, for more than 10,000 years and had been sustained by these lands that were now being called empty and useless. The story not only presents an alternative spatiality that disputes claims of capital in the state, but it also marks out a central place for Indigenous women in territorial conflicts. Not only does Dora Rouge hold superior knowledge of the waterways that supersedes that of European explorers, but she also remembers traditional uses of plants. This knowledge resonates with cartographic endeavors by Indigenous groups beginning in the 1970s, the time frame of the novel, to establish legal claims to land. During this era, the Canadian government commenced use and occupancy studies to establish the legitimacy of Aboriginal title. Most often, including in the context of the James Bay dispute, these took shape by mapping projects that documented the relationship of Indigenous communities to their territories by representing histories, place names, and subsistence and cultural practices. Such mapping projects, observes Mac Chapin, have provided, this is a quote, a powerful tool for Indigenous peoples in their struggles to defend and claim their ancestral lands and preserve their cultures, end quote. Yet a shortcoming, he points out, has been that women remain weakly represented in Indigenous mapping. As Solar Storms places women at the center of this project of mapping, the story makes these women the leaders in the fight that, in the James Bay dispute, halts the construction of the dams and culminates in land claims. Solar Storms then follows Lord's installation and the map of Atunarjuat by engaging in a project of remapping that represents native spatialities and shows how they are politically bound up with Indigenous claims to land. It extends beyond these other works, though, by telling a story that draws upon history to bring to light the integral connections among gendered violence, colonial conquest, and dispossession. In so doing, it lays out a path for an Indigenous activism that insists on the centrality of gender and Native resistance to the ongoing project of colonization. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
So thank you, Shari. For my response, I thought it might be useful if I did a little mapping of my own, this time not of land or history, but of the field of Native American cultural and literary studies, and specifically criticism, as it seems to be operating today. So several years ago, the literary critic Arnold Krupat identified three basic critical perspectives, as he called them, that he thought were dominant in the field in our time. These were nationalism, Indigenism, and cosmopolitanism. The nationalist bases his or her critical position foremost upon his or her understanding of the term sovereignty. The nation can be construed as either a tribal nation or a settler colonial nation. You're looking at that relationship. That stuff is the focus of nationalist criticism, which can often lead to the promotion of what Muskogee Creek scholar Craig Womack calls tribally specific aesthetics, or to what he, Jace Weaver, and Robert Warrior proclaimed in an influential 2006 book as Native American cultural separatism, or literary separatism. Indigenists, the second school, or perspective, by contrast, focus not on the nation so much as the earth, sometimes construed as a mother, and a worldview that could be called traditional or tribal. This traditional worldview emphasizes a spiritual attachment to sacred lands, as well as a different ethnic episteme, or a system of knowledge, one that might be contrasted to another cultural system of knowledge, for instance, one transforming land into property. Finally, there is the cosmopolitan perspective, emphasizing worldliness, universality, and internationalism, which studies native cultural texts with an acknowledgement that comparisons and solidarities and translations are at least as important as separatisms or radical epistemological differences. Nationalists and indigenists, Krupat wrote, sometimes overlap, and both tend to see themselves as apart from and in opposition to the cosmopolitans. Nonetheless, as it turns out, all three positions were for Krupat, overlapping and interlinked so that each could only achieve its full coherence and effectiveness in relation to the other two. Furthermore, all three positions may be enlisted for the project of an anti-colonial criticism, as all three may also operate to reproduce colonial dominance under other names. Finally, Krupat stressed that these three positions were critical perspectives. They were not inherent to any cultural product or text itself, nor were they reducible to any particular identity. They described what got stressed in the criticism, so it identifies what people are looking for when they look at something. So Professor Huhndorf's paper, I think, is an example of how these perspectives overlap, as she reads all three of her cultural sites for how they address states from the perspective of a tribal specificity or nationalism, for example, the Inuit dealing with the US and Canada, as well as how they tend to challenge what we might call a Western cultural transformation of land into property, or in other words, indigenism. Yet her claim that global political and economic shifts have transformed indigenous organizing and cultural production, that's a quote, those shifts, that is to say, instead of a tribal specificity or a traditional culture, that seems to be a cosmopolitan's observation, as is her focus on, quote, patriarchy, environmental exploitation, and capitalist labor formations, along with, as she writes, long-standing preoccupations with land and sovereignty. Such statements seem to place her criticism alongside that of other feminist, ecological, and Marxist critics who analyze similar global forces that drive cultural production and global politics. But what are these forces or shifts that she identifies? I would suggest that they are simply the forces of globalization itself, by which I mean an intensification of an already existing set of forces and processes of production that really speed up, you might say, in the mid to late 20th century. These would be things like the rise of global financial institutions, the WTO, the IMF, the G20, as well as the rise of giant transnational corporations, all of which are seeking new venues and new networks for the circulation of capital. Also the rise of new political institutions such as NATO, the UN, and a wide range of NGOs, and a general sense that the domination of nation-states and old-style imperialisms, the kind that we do still discuss quite a lot in Native American studies, seems to have been somewhat superseded by what Hart and Negri in 2000 called empire. They meant this new global order, a diffuse and universal empire without a center. They compared it to the internet. A social formation that can be considered all at once a monarchy, an oligarchy, and a democracy. Lacking a specific imperial palace or a given state house that one might attack, this new stage of capitalism, which is total, meaning everywhere, is resisted by what they called the will to be against. I see that kind of resistance in Erica Lord's Native American Land Reclamation Project, which, as Hahndorf states, not only, quote, underscores the histories and meanings of land that support indigenous claims, but reworks practices of spectatorship implicated in dispossession, unquote, specifically a history of landscape representation. As Hahndorf said, quote, the installation transforms the exhibition space from one of spectacle to one of encounter. But it seems ambiguous to me who is encountering whom in that rather open to interpretation text. Hahndorf correctly states, I think, that on one level the encounter is certainly between the spectator and the indigenous, or the indigenous and the indigenous, as the case may be. But it seems that another possible encounter there is between the winners and the losers in globalization. Or as Professor Hahndorf concludes that section, Lord's installation, quote, engages in an act of territorial reclamation against the interest of capital and the state. Hahndorf's paper and the three texts it analyzes emphasizes the importance of visibility for natives. It's not only visibility as such that's so important. One can find visibility from Buffalo Bill to Johnny Depp on a fairly consistent basis, but rather the specific visibility of the settler-colonial relationship between natives and states. It is a truism in the interdisciplinary field of settler colonial studies that typically and historically settlers have tried to make themselves native to the lands that they dominate, while the natives are supposed to vanish. Cultural resistance then takes the form of what Lorenzo Veracini calls a refusal to go away. Hahndorf's analysis of the remarkable film Adenarjuat makes the important claim against earlier critics that the film does not operate in a timeless realm, but rather unfolds in a realm that is enduring rather than atemporal. While she focuses on the alternative map created by the film producers and promoters, I would add that the film's credits roll before scenes of the actors and the production team working and playing while wearing modern clothes, including especially a black leather motorcycle jacket worn by one of the lead actors, and showing the modern filmmaking technologies, the cameras and the tracks and stuff that they used as the credits roll up, as of course they did when they made the film. So while the film can be read as Huhndorf reads it, as depicting the histories and practices that constitute long-term occupation, possession, and use of traditional lands, that's a kind of visibility showing continuity. It also depicts Inuits living in a modern world. That's a different kind of visibility showing change, as does that map, which of course is on the internet. Situating her interpretation in the context of the creation of Nunavut, Huhndorf's analysis of this film and this map seems like an instance of Krupat's nationalist critical perspective, but her emphasis on mapping, temporality, and visibility more generally speak to discourses of capitalism and modernity as well. So not only are Native people still here, they are making movies and developing websites and such. Mapping is important to Professor Huhndorf's third and final text as well, Solar Storms by Linda Hogan. Hogan, it should be said, writes fiction that tends to elicit the indigenous critical perspective on the part of many readers. She's very popular, for instance, with feminist eco-critics. Huhndorf's analysis focuses on the violence of history as it appears on the land, bodies, and the psyches of Native women in the novel. And she argues that the story, quote, not only presents an alternative spatiality that disputes claims of capital and the state, but it also marks out a central place for Indigenous women in territorial conflicts, unquote. One might add a central space for Native women in epistemological conflicts too, as these characters seem to have knowledge that is more amenable to survival than that offered by the colonial history. So while I agree with Huhndorf on the value of placing Indigenous women at the center of a textual reimagination of history, I have to confess that I have a slight concern with Hogan's work generally, or in this case, with her deeper map, the map inside ourselves, as stated in Hogan's text, and it's very characteristic of her work in general, because it risks removing the Native from history, and specifically modernity, in ways that I think other texts do not. I'm suggesting that it promotes a kind of essentialism that does not necessarily challenge settler colonialism or global capitalism. I actually think it borders on promoting what is historically called the noble savage. At the most one could say is that it's identity politics. The work of, so that's my critique, but the work of Shari Huhndorf with its anti-essentialist politics and firm insistence on social justice, as well as the importance she consistently places on paying close attention to gender, to global economic and political shifts, and to transnational indigenous culture, is a model for cultural critics in Native American studies and beyond.
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking Shari Huhndorf for this wonderfully rich and illuminating paper. It's a real honor for me to have the opportunity to respond to this paper. I was introduced to her book, Going Native, Indians in the American Cultural Imagination, several years ago, and actually was so excited about its implications for some of the literary texts that I'd been working with that I was inspired to teach a course called Going Native, which was very much organized around some of the ideas in that book. So thank you on multiple levels. So the paper that we just heard offers, as you've heard, a close reading of three very different works of Native visual and literary cultural resistance. Eric Lord's installation, the online map, Legend of the Land associated with the Inuit film, and Linda Hogan's novel. Shari's analysis shows how all three of these works respond in distinct and powerful ways to long histories of dispossession, by destabilizing received histories and colonial discourses about the land first, by recovering and restoring visibility to erased histories grounded in the sacred and lived experience, and finally by reinscribing the Native presence in the landscape and in historical time. What I most appreciated myself in her analysis was the deft interweaving of the processes of telling and untelling stories, which seem to happen in all three works in a very interesting kind of counterpoint. The naming of past wrongs on the one hand, alongside, on the other hand, invitations to the audience to participate in potentially disorienting ways in the reconstruction of the past, and by implication also the future. Beyond identifying these gestures of unwriting and rewriting histories of encounters in these three works, though the paper, I think, works on, Shari's paper, that is, works on a deeper level to call our attention to some of the rhetorical strategies that are involved in these works and to the tensions that these strategies might entail. The paper title is Culture and Politics of Indigenous Transnationalism, and in one sense, the connection between culture and politics suggested in the title is very straightforward. All three of these works can be read, after all, as cultural responses to the historical and political effects of the colonizing process. So, for example, the Land Reclamation Project shows, in Shari's words, the native dispossession as the foundation of U.S. history. But in another sense, the paper implies, I think, that the connection between these two terms of politics and culture is considerably more subtle and complex than those straightforward and somewhat polemical statements or implications. What I mean by this is that the rhetorical choices made by the creators of these works, as Shari lays them out, entail distinct political strategies as well. Now, this observation, of course, is closely related to what we heard from Jens Dahl earlier this morning on the strategic deployment of symbolic capital for political ends in the history that he was telling, and the ways that those kinds of choices can entail, advantages and otherwise, and connected also perhaps with Scott's three positions that he laid out at the beginning of his response. I found myself thinking in reading the paper and again in hearing it about the stakes and the consequences of these various strategic choices that are made by the creators of these three works, and thinking then about the kinds of political possibilities that are both enabled or perhaps also closed off by each kind of choice. What I'll do in the next few minutes is focus on two distinct axes of political strategizing that seem to me to be foregrounded by Shari's readings of the three works, and in each case then outline just a couple of questions that the paper raises for me. So the first axis of strategic choice, I think that came out for me, was the question of collective identity. And we heard a lot about the history of political collectivity catalyzed by the United Nations over the past 50 years in the first presentation this morning. So the central question here, it seems like the strategic question that these creators or authors are grappling with is the following: how is the identity of a Native community to be represented, and what are the consequences of this representational choice? Shari's analysis foregrounds Indigenous affiliations and claims to collectivity of at least three distinct types. First of all, there are the shared relationships with the land that predate the arrival of settlers. Secondly, there's the shared history of dispossession in the colonial period. And third, there are the shared political purposes in the present. And we see this sense of a kind of quite self-conscious, shared affiliative construction in the example of the assertion of geographical and historical continuities in the Legend of the Land map, which, as Shari says, creates collective identity by depicting Nunavut as a coherent, bounded entity, and giving this imagined community a long and distinctive history. The key term here in Shari's formulation, of course, is imagined community. Surely the creators of this map invoked or considered the invocation of imagined community as a deliberate strategic choice. It very clearly has benefits. It enables solidarity. It makes history legible in familiar terms, right? The terms in which we've been accustomed to thinking about history in quasi-nationalist terms, but it also brings with it a potential cost, or several costs. First, the replication, perhaps, of colonialist categories and boundaries of the kind associated with 19th century nationalism. And secondly, the loss of the possibility, potentially, of the recuperation of alternative kinds of history making. So the question I found myself thinking about here was what specific possibilities are visible in these works for narrating a compelling and effective counter-hegemonic story of indigenous past without replicating the structures of nationalist historiography, right? I mean, that is, drawing boundaries around land masses and claiming sort of coherent histories for the groups within those boundaries. What are the advantages of these various approaches, and how do they interact within individual works? I found especially provocative in thinking about this question the description of the native land reclamation project in two respects. First of all, the red stripes taken from the U.S. flag being used to wrap up these bundles of earth, struck me as a wonderfully evocative way of appropriating and repurposing symbols of colonizing power in an ironic and subversive way, as she points out. And then also the individual prayer bundles themselves seem to me to assert a form of solidarity that does not flatten difference or make a kind of claim to uniformity as a boundary on a map might tend to do. The second axis of strategic choice-making that came out for me in the paper had to do with the question of colonialist ideology or colonialist discourse. And here the basic question is, how is the story of dispossession to be told? Shari's analysis identifies a number of elements of colonialist ideology, and especially colonial discourses on land and spatiality, which are foregrounded by the three works. And these four elements were European cartography, right, modern map making. Secondly, perspective as an art historical technique, right? Third, homogenizing capital as a new conception of economic relations. And fourth, the idea of property as commodity. What I simply want to observe here is the historical contingency of these developments. Implicit in Shari's presentation is a reminder that all three of these components are products of the particular context of European early modernity, which arguably results then in a kind of double alienation at the moment of encounter, where indigeneity comes to be understood not only through cultural otherness or othering, but also through historical othering, modern versus pre-modern, right? So there's the implicit strategic choice in these works on this axis of ideology is of this kind, that the critique of the ideological instruments of European early modernity is strategically effective in one sense as a basis for anti-colonialist, anti-Enlightenment critique. It's effective also in an aesthetic sense, in that it invites an affective response on the part of the reader or viewer, a kind of primitivist nostalgia, which can be appropriated for all sorts of purposes. But it also comes at a clear cost, right? In that it can tend to paint indigenous peoples into the dark corner of timeless pre-modernity, right? And to preempt the possibility then of asserting historical contemporaneity. Or as Scott just put it, it might have the effect of seeming to remove the natives from history. So the question then is, well, what other options to this kind of bifurcating critique are suggested by these works? And it seems to me that thinking about this question requires complicating the assumptions, our familiar assumptions of coherence and collectivity, this time not so much on the native or indigenous side, but on the European or modern side. It's important to keep in mind, I think, that Enlightenment modernity, right, this thing from which all of these colonizing discourses emerged, for all of its universalizing claims, was not historically, is not a monolithic juggernaut, right, as we sometimes fall into the trap of imagining. Every period, in every period of historical transformation, one can argue that nothing from the past, from previous periods, is ever left behind. Right? While early modern Europeans did invent and deploy these new ways of conceiving reality to often devastating effect, the Enlightenment mission of self-conversion was never complete. Right? It remains incomplete. It's an unfulfilled project. It's a failure in many ways. Early frameworks, earlier pre-modern frameworks or habits of thought persisted and continue to persist as real and potent forces, even in so-called modern settler communities. And so then the question is, well, what possibilities might be available or present in these kinds of works or in other related works for Indigenous voices to claim affiliations not just with other Indigenous peoples who share a history of dispossession, but also with resonant elements within settler societies, which are, after all, presumably no more homogenous in their embrace of the project of Enlightenment modernity than are Indigenous peoples in their strategic embrace of collective Indigenous identities. Thank you.
Well, thank you to both of you. So, as most of you in this room know, when you see reviews of your work, your books or whatever, sometimes you completely despair and think, I never actually said what this person says I was saying. But sometimes you get these really rich responses that show you where you need to push harder and do better and complicate your thinking. And both of these responses were of that category for me. So, genuine thanks to both of you. So of those really rich responses, I want to pick up on just a couple of points. So David, you were absolutely right to suggest that all of these political and representational strategies are double-edged. And sometimes, in our sort of zeal to support Indigenous political causes, we conveniently overlook, some of the political shortcomings and limitations of these projects, and I think you were right to insist on that. That's also true of representational strategies, and I just want to give, one example of that from some of these materials that I looked at. So I was actually very positive in a kind of unqualified way about the politics of visuality and what it means to insert an Indigenous contemporary presence through visual means. But that is a strategy that, as you suggest, has been very double-edged, and that is true, among other places, with regard to the reception of Ahtanaarjuat. So what happens when Indigenous people are represented visually is not only is this contemporary presence asserted, but these images immediately enter into a global visual field, full of images of Indigenous people that have tend to exoticize, commodify, dehistoricize, depoliticize. And that was actually true of Ahtanaarjuat. So I wrote about this elsewhere, about the ways in which that film emerged from this film collective that was very explicitly interested in furthering a land claims agenda. But as the film was distributed internationally, it completely lost its political meanings and became a kind of depoliticized, ahistorical, ethnographic document. That's how it was received. And no one could, Scott, you talked about the outtakes. So many people wrestled with what to do with the outtakes because these are contemporary images. What does that mean? Really speaks to that, that kind of reception that muted the political meaning. So that's absolutely right. We need to acknowledge the complexities. And Scott, just to take one point from your very, very rich response, I think you were really right, and this goes to a similar point, to focus on the ways in which globalization has completely transformed the Indigenous world everywhere in ways that we need to take account of. And your work is very masterful at doing this. And I wanted to focus on this point in particular because it goes to that issue that's already been raised a couple of times this morning about how we define Indigenous identities and what constitutes a legitimate Indigenous identity. And historicity and temporality are so integral to those questions. And it remains true that people have a very hard time thinking about change and Indigenous people in the contemporary world being not what they were in the traditional world as being still somehow legitimate. And so I think you were really right to point out the extent to which, the Indigenous world has been transformed, but is no less Indigenous because of it. And as I mentioned, your work is really concerned with this question, very important issue, and I think it comes to bear also on all of the cultural texts that I looked at. So thank you for raising that. And I don't know if there are questions or if we have time for questions, but.
Sure.
Everyone's hungry, I think.
What time is lunch?
Yeah, exactly. That's the question.
Can we go?
So let me say thank you so much to
Thank you.
the panelists and
Yeah.